Good evening, and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians. Hello, friends. This is your happy Hollywood history host, Mr. Ben Burke, here today with my brilliant friend and co-host, Mr. Garrett McPherson, to talk about the history of the Cold War and thermonuclear combat. If you like what you hear today, be sure to tune in on Friday when we talk about the complete production history behind Stanley Kubrick's nightmare black comedy, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, from Columbia Pictures in 1964, starring Peter Sellers, George C. Scott, Sterling Hayden, and Slim Pickens. Only on the Hollywood Babylonians. So first off, because Dr. Strangelove deals with the Cold War and nuclear bombs, thermonuclear war, I asked Garrett, because he loves history so much, if he would talk to all of us or educate us on the Cold War and kind of the happenings up to the point of 64 or 62, 63 that Strangelove was made. So would you like to take it away?
Of course. So there's a lot we can go into. Specifically, the origins of the Cold War come out of World War II. So you have the Axis powers, which are Nazi Germany, Italy under Mussolini, and the Empire of Japan, versus the Allies, who are mainly the big players in the Allies are the United States, the United Kingdom, and the USSR. And France and other countries, but those are the three big dogs. There's a lot of there's famous photos of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all meeting and having conferences, and it's escaping me which one the famous one is from, but I think it's Yalta. I could be wrong. And basically, the Allies defeat the Axis powers in 1945, and it becomes very clear that as Germany is falling, that the two powers that are going to come out of World War II, the strongest, are the United States and the USSR, so communist Soviet Russia. And as that's happening, there's a few dominoes that are starting to fall into place. One is there's a race to Berlin towards the final parts of the war. And in the final few months of the war, there's a race between the US and the Russians to get to Berlin. But I'm pretty sure the Russians get there first because they raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, and it's this big deal. But as they are converging on Berlin, US government calls it Operation Paperclip. I'm not sure what the Russians call it, but it's the same principle, where they are trying to recruit as many German scientists as they can, because as the war was wrapping up, it became clear to Stalin, the leader of Russia, that the United States had nuclear capabilities, so that they had a nuclear bomb, which at that point was, I believe it was the atom bomb, because the hydrogen bomb comes later. And so that became clear, and they're leveraging for position, because all of a sudden it becomes very clear to Truman at this point, because Roosevelt has passed away, it becomes very clear that who comes out of this war is going to be who has the best nuclear capability. So Operation Paperclip, they start to recruit German scientists and rocket scientists, a lot of which are Nazis. It's the modern U.S. space program is built off of Nazi scientists.
Well, real fast, we're going to get back to Operation Paperclip, because that fuels a little bit of the Strangelove characterization, which you can see, but I did not know. I had never heard of Operation Paperclip. And you talk about now cultural appropriation, shooting that down, and us being like, what in the actual freak? Yeah. But
so much success of the U.S. moving past World War II is on the back of Nazi scientists. I mean, Werner von Braun, I'm sure we'll talk about him with Dr. Strangelove, because he's, and it's both of those countries, which both of them hated fascism and Nazism for different reasons. I guess the U.S. hated Nazis. We have a weird relationship with fascism, as we've seen. But the Soviets, communism and fascism are like diametrically opposed. So their whole thing is a lot different. But yeah, so Operation Paperclip happens, is taking place, and the war in Europe ends. The war in Japan is still going on. And in the final months of the Pacific Theater War, there are talks about Russia piling on, because at that point, Russia hadn't been involved in the war in the Pacific, and they didn't. And essentially, what the numbers that the U.S. was kind of wargaming was, if we invade the island of Japan, casualties will be up towards about 1 million. Civilians and military personnel, all that. And so they were wargaming and playing the numbers, and decided to drop 2 nuclear bombs to try to convince the government of Japan to surrender. So we drop one on Nagasaki and on Hiroshima. The only case of nuclear weapons at the recording of this podcast being used for, in a military context, on an enemy target. So that happens, and moving past World War II, there's a few big key markers, but basically a nuclear arm race begins where both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, are just stockpiling nuclear weapons. It gets to the point where there's this concept called mutually assured destruction, where if one of these countries drops a bomb, the other one will retaliate and everyone will be destroyed. Like, there's enough nuclear weapons to just kind of end the world, which is the context of Dr. Strangelove, because that's kind of what they're talking about. So you have that, and while all of this is happening with the nuclear arms race, there's ideological conflicts and proxy wars, which are basically conflicts in what becomes known as the Third World. That wasn't a phrase necessarily until the Cold War, because the Third World is basically, you've got first world countries being the U.S. I'm pretty sure this is the breakdown. First world are U.S. and the USSR. Second world are their allies. So like Britain would be second world. That's not how we use it today, but I believe that's the concept. And then the third world are countries that can go both, and most of them are former colonies of different Western powers normally, who aren't colonized anymore and are moving into their own independent states. Right. And so what ends up happening is the Soviet Union often backs socialist revolutions, and the US often backs right-wing, sometimes fascist dictators for the most part. Where this comes to a head is in a couple places. One, you have Berlin, which was separated into 4 different sectors. That's not the third world debate, but it is important because it's kind of a hot point that leads to what we're going to talk about, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Berlin is 4 quadrants. You have the British sector, the American sector, the French sector, and the Russian sector, which basically becomes the Russian and the West. And in 1961, the Russians build a wall, the Berlin Wall, to basically keep people from moving east to west and west to east. And that is a sign of escalation of the Cold War. Because up until that point, like there had been some escalation, like the nuclear stockpiling had been escalating, but there hadn't been very much like very overt signs of aggression. And the Berlin Wall is not super aggressive, but it is like, this is where it stops. Before that, the U.S. had put some missile sites in Turkey and Italy, which had kind of put a distance between them and the USSR. But the Berlin Wall really kind of set things off.
And didn't Khrushchev? He gave, like in '61, he gave Kennedy an ultimatum. He said the U.S. needs to be out of Berlin by December. And they did not. So he started building the wall.
He's flexing his muscles, right? Like he's trying to and part of that is because Khrushchev had just spent 8 years dealing with Dwight D. Eisenhower, who he couldn't push around. Dwight D. Eisenhower very much was like a very strongman type of leader as far as Cold War politics go. And nobody really wanted to mess with Dwight. And then JFK comes in and wins the election. And the Russians are like, okay, we can push this guy around. He's not, and there's Americans who think he's not going to be strong on communism. There's a lot of doubts about JFK. And so that's where like stuff like the Berlin Wall comes in. And actually, to tie it back to the third world thing, one of the countries to emerge and become really important is Cuba, which is, 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1959, there's a revolution in Cuba led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And at the time, it was a rebellion against a military dictator named Batista. And it had widespread support. At the beginning, it wasn't expressly socialist or communist. It was just it was a people's revolution. But then, like as you move from 59 into 60, Fidel Castro very quickly begins to ally himself with the USSR. There was also concern that he was going to ally himself more closely to China, because there's these schools of communist thought, and Russia and China don't really mix very well. They're allies because they have to be, but they don't agree on a lot of things. Just about how communism should be practiced, as if it's denominations of communism, you know? But it's interesting because Fidel Castro, post the revolution, actually had a pretty warm, like he had relations with the US. It wasn't like, we're not talking to the US at all. Like he was just trying to leverage his position. And as soon as it became clear that Russia was where he would be stronger, he very quickly made it evident that this was a socialist communist revolution, which kind of surprised the Russians, because at that point Nikita Khrushchev had been kind of trying to claim innocence, right? Like he didn't want to encroach on the US. So he's like, I mean, they're doing their thing and we'll support them, but we're not the same thing. We're not the same club. Once Fidel Castro made it very clear that they were going to be communists, the Russians didn't have a choice. They're like, well, okay, we have to move in, but we also have an opportunity here to have a foothold 90 miles away from the United States mainland, which is a big deal. Because remember, at this point, the U.S. has missile sites in Turkey and Italy, with the with the reasoning to be they can start launching missiles if they have to into Russia. Once Russia and or the Soviet Union and Cuba become close allies, the U.S. isn't very happy, and Kennedy's feeling pressure because all of a sudden they're like, well, you're being weak on communism. There's a communist country 90 miles away, an hour and a half drive if you could drive it on a car, right? They're right there. And so, but they concoct this plan. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so basically the CIA goes in and says, there's Cuban immigrants here in the US that want to go back and fight a revolution in Cuba and take over the Fidel Castro-led revolution. And so they concoct a plan to basically put these Cuban exiles onto the island and start an invasion. Yeah. But with the whole premise is like the U.S. is not involved. That's what they're saying. The U.S. is not involved at all. And Kennedy, as the Bay of Pigs comes along, he's really indecisive. When the operation actually takes place in 61, like the day of, there was in the book I was reading, there was a timeline they were talking about where they needed to have a decision from him by like 10 a.m. Mm-hmm. And at 1 p.m. because he was on vacation, but he had a hotline, like he knew what was going on. Right. And at 1 p.m. he still hadn't made a decision. Yeah. So Kennedy puts himself in a position of like, if this goes bad, I can wash my hands up. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't go well. Like the American people aren't happy. The CIA isn't happy. Mm-hmm. A lot of the conspiracy theories that the CIA assassinated Kennedy, which those exist, stem from this incident, because he basically just kind of throws everybody under the bus, including Adlai Stevenson, who was at that point, the character
Merkin Muffley,
Merkin Muffley is loosely based on. He was the ambassador to the UN, and he had no idea. He had been saying, because they knew he'd be against it. They knew he would be against it, so they intentionally did not tell him. Mm-hmm. And so he's at the UN saying, the U.S., there's no involvement. We have nothing to do with this. Right. And then gets screwed over, because then it becomes very clear. And he's like, he almost resigns. Like he's like, once my term is up, I'm not working for Kennedy again. Right. Like it's a bad deal. But basically, so this invasion fails. That's in 61. as it's happening, like there's still tension between the USSR and the US, but the midterm elections are coming up in 62. And while that's going on, Khrushchev and Kennedy have been in communications, and basically they have like a gentleman's promise that neither of us are going to make any moves until after the general election, until after Congress, there's a new Congress. And Kennedy has leveraged this because he's like, if Russia makes a move and I don't do the right thing, I'm going to lose the power I have in Congress. Khrushchev agrees, but it's like a gentleman's agreement. And honestly, tying it to the movie, it really reminds me of that first phone call they have with the hotline, where it's like this kind of congenial, like it's a weird relationship. Like they're enemies, but there's like pleasantries. And everything I was reading about Khrushchev and Kennedy is like their relationship was kind of like that. It wasn't warm or anything, but there was like this, it was way more personable than you would think two world leaders who can blow up the whole world would be. But like personal dynamics and personal characters, personalities really play a big role in how this stuff goes down. A scary role in how this goes down.
Well, and Sellers improvised that entire conversation, both phone conversations he had.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Meredith was watching it with me the other night, and she goes, he had to memorize this whole monologue. And now I have to go back and say, no, he didn't. So basically, while Khrushchev has made this promise, this loose promise that they won't make any moves, he is secretly moving missiles into Cuba. And they're keeping it on the down low. Because obviously, if they do it, it's very obvious a sign of aggression if they get caught. CIA is seeing ships go back and forth to Cuba. Like they know something's going on.
Right.
But they also don't want to blow it up. Because if they come out too soon and say this is going on, then that looks bad for Kennedy, and like they can't go through the back channels at that point to figure this out. So while that's happening, Kennedy is so like he's angry. He feels like he's been screwed over because he has been. There's a quarantine. They call it a quarantine. It's really a blockade, but there's a naval blockade they put around Cuba and basically stop any Russian ships coming in or any coming out. It comes to a head when it gets released to the press that Cuba's stockpiling weapons, or the USSR is stockpiling weapons on Cuba. And there's a 13-day period where in October...
Wasn't Strategic Air Command put on like DEFCON 4 or something
like that? Yeah, DEFCON 4, which was a big deal. Like it's the highest that can go, which freaked the Russians out because it had never gotten that high. And the Russians were like, we're about to blow up the whole world. And that's kind of the thing. Everybody in this whole, that's what reminded me. So you say DEFCON 4. Literally the account of the Russian account post talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Khrushchev had heard that they had gone to DEFCON 4, he crapped his pants literally in his office because it was that serious. Like they had never gotten to this point. So basically they're at a standoff. They don't know what's going to happen. You have some people within the US government that are like, let's just destroy the missile sites and then invade Cuba. Let's do that. You have some that are, saying, let's keep up the blockade. And you have some that are saying, well, we can de-escalate this. And the agreement that they come to is essentially that the US is going to pull out their missiles. Or no, they didn't pull them. They pulled them out later. The agreement they come to is that the US will promise not to invade Cuba again, not have another Bay of Pigs. In exchange for doing that, Russia will pull their missiles out of Cuba. So they do that, and we all live to fight another day. Post that, there are still Soviet bombers that stay on Cuba, and the US still has their missiles in Turkey, but they do eventually pull those out, and it kind of de-escalates. But we came very close to nuclear war. Like there are stories of how close things happen, and it is funny.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say this book, it's called Reconstructing Strangelove by Mick Broderick. He talks about, there's a speech that I can read to you. In the event that we were to go in on Cuba, Americans had no idea that Soviet military commanders later said after the fall of the Soviet Union that if we were to have pursued any sort of action, they were to deploy deploy nuclear weapons on us.
We were we were also so underinformed. So the U.S. intelligence thought there were 10,000 troops on Cuba, 10,000 Russian troops. It came out later that there were 43,000. And they did not know that during the crisis. And it really makes you think, like, if they had known the extent of how many Russians were on that island, if they knew that it was 43,000, they probably would have moved against Cuba and against the USSR.
Right.
Kind of like you were saying, like it was a hair trigger situation.
Well, and there was a speech that was drafted by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. McGeorge is a great name. And President Kennedy's speechwriter refused to write this speech because he was a pacifist. He was not for war in any way. But this speech was written, "My fellow Americans, with a heavy heart and in necessary fulfillment of my oath in office, I have ordered and the United States Air Force has now carried out military operations with conventional weapons only to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup from the soil of Cuba. The United States of America need not and cannot tolerate defiance, deception, and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small." And so it keeps going on. But if he had given this speech, and if they had gone in, as this speech says, we probably would not be talking right now.
Yeah, it's nuts. There's a story from this book I was reading that, one, like you said, like so much of this was on the personalities of the people involved, and that's scary. But also, one of the specific stories was the USSR deployed like 4 submarines, I think it was. And there was a situation where basically they were very close to sending off those missiles. One of the guys was climbing up the I believe it was a telescope room tower thing, and he got stuck. And because he got stuck, he didn't see something that was happening. So they didn't give the order. But literally just because this guy got stuck on a submarine, they didn't give the order to blow things up, which happens in Doctor Strangelove, but it's the opposite, right? Like rather than things that save us, it's the fluke things that doom us. Because you have the whole thing with the radio, and you have the whole thing, it's those fluke things that like, we are so close. We are so close. It just takes one of these things going the wrong way, and we're going to blow the whole thing up. No matter how many fail safes they are, because they talk about that often in the movie, the fail safes.
Right.
And they're just not. I think that's some of the comedy of the movie is that they do come up with the perfect plan for it to happen, but because it's the perfect plan, once it's set in motion, you can't stop it. So is it perfect? But yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the context of up to the Cuban Missile Crisis that led to the movie, right? Because the movie came out in '64. So that's kind of the Cold War up until that point. Unless there's anything else specific you want to talk about.
Oh yeah, it was great. It was amazing. That is really fascinating.
You have been listening to The Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians is produced, hosted, edited, and written by Ben Burke and co-hosted by Garrett McPherson. Audio engineering by Andrew Davis. Artwork by Jamie Lee and Ben Burke, with research by Garrett McPherson. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Tune in next time as we explore another film from the golden age of Hollywood and the history behind it. Thank you for listening and have a good night.